Hi everyone. This represents a review or guide to the self-assessments based upon Induction Standards 5 and 6. The purpose of the self-assessment essentially is to reflect upon the evidence that you have already collected from your current or recent fact work, such as your context for teaching, where you uncovered information about your students, your school, your district, and your community, observations that you have done, such as for the observation write-up, your support provider conversations, and if you're in year one, this was the year that you completed the assessment for teaching and learning. Another purpose is for you to reflect upon your practice, resulting in your identification of the strengths and challenges of your practice. Here we can see a visual that supports your previous work in the context for teaching and learning. And if you're in year one, you have already completed the assessment of teaching and learning this year. If you're in year two, this was what you did last year. This was where you had conversations with your support provider about what you know about your practice, what you want to know about your practice, and what you would like your support provider to observe. That was followed by in-depth conversations with insights as to what you learned from that observation and conversation. In addition, in the observation write-up, you observed a colleague teaching, identifying a specific purpose to your observation, and reflecting upon what you may or may not want to bring back to your practice. You're now asked to take all of these experiences, plus the many experiences from your day-to-day teaching practice, and reflect upon your teaching practice as a whole. However, rather than one large open-ended question, you're asked to specifically reflect upon areas of your practice identified through the induction standards. So this represents your self-assessments. This is where you've been, and this is where you're going. As a direct result of these self-assessments, you will be asked to select a focus. This focus will then drive your inquiry that you will find later in year one, and which you are completing 2 times in year 2. As a result of your self-assessments, you'll be asked to determine an area of focus for your practice. This will be something you will consider for your inquiry. What you see in front of you now is the individual induction plan. It is here where you will determine, based upon your self-assessments, areas of growth that you would like to investigate. We're going to look at, on this individual induction plan, box number 1. In this particular area, you're asked to, based on your self-assessments, determine an area of focus. This represents an example of how you would use the results of your self-assessment. The example states, while reflecting upon my practice during the self-assessments, I began to consider how I could improve my current practice in 2 areas. The 2 areas for this individual are listed as multi-tiered interventions and teaching practice. We're not going to go into what this document or what an inquiry means at this point, but this is where you're going to use the data that you gather from your self-assessments. This document you may recognize as the fact verification form for the self-assessment standards 5 and 6 and CSTPs 1 and 2. We're going to scroll down to the first page to show you some of the supports that are in place to help you as you move through this self-assessment. The most obvious and critical support is the work that you do with your support provider. There are times, however, when you've discussed with your support provider and you're sitting alone in front of your computer, ready to begin to respond to these, and some additional prompts or decoding of the prompts may help you. Every time you see a yellow tag here, you will find information to help support you as you move forward to complete your self-assessments. This is a decoding of the prompt or additional information to support you as you respond to the prompt. Here, in these areas, this assists you in how to approach the format or expectations of what you will find in each of these responses. Let's take a look at the options for a response to these prompts first. If you're a year 1 participating teacher and this is your first time responding to this prompt, you're going to want to use this box here. Please make sure that you include the date because that becomes critical as you read through your self-assessments. On the screen now, what you see is one teacher's response to the self-assessment prompts. And notice it's a series of 3 bullets. It's bulleted, but there's also a narrative form. It explains what the teacher is doing and how they use this information. Does your information need to be this length? Not necessarily. Notice that here the teacher gives 2 bullets as to what they do and 1 challenge. Is this required? No. It would be expected that you would have some challenges throughout your self-assessment because, again, what we're looking for is your reflection on the strengths and challenges of your practice. So some combination of strengths and challenges would be expected. So given that example, what is expected within the responses? If you refer back to your fact verification form that's included with all of your other self-assessment documents, you're going to notice the expectations are clearly outlined here. Within the self-assessment document, you'll be referred back to here because this is a really good description of what needs to be included. Each response needs to be directly related to the reflection planning prompt. That's the question that you're given along with some supports in this little yellow tag. So is the response directly related to this question? If you're unsure what the question is asking, this is a prompt to help you with that. What is another expectation? Think about your classroom practice. Consider the strengths, challenges, and the depth of implementation as you describe your classroom practice related to each area. Provide examples that are detailed and specific. So instead of stating that you use SEDI strategies or scaffolding or multi-tiered interventions, explain what that means. Scaffolding to one person may mean something different to another. So if you say, I use scaffolding practices such as, give an indication so that any individual reading this knows exactly what you mean by that statement. Provide at least 2 examples. Short paragraphs or bullets are both acceptable. Again, it is not necessarily better to write more. You want to write directly to the prompt, you want to state exactly what you do, and a little descriptor of what that means. So for example, if you're asked how you provide a safe classroom, stating, I provide a safe classroom for all my students, doesn't give an indication of how you do that. So focus on what strategies you use and how you accomplish that standard. Are you expected to have accomplished each and every standard to the highest level possible? No. So you're sharing the teaching strategies that you currently employ in order to meet that standard. Here is an example of one teacher's response to the reflection planning prompt about using multiple measures. We can use this as an example. Notice that the teacher has provided 3 bullets with explanation. Let's take a moment to look at this. One way I monitor students' progress is through computer programs such as my OnReader and GoMath. Then she explains, these computer programs help me set up individual assignments for students based upon their needs. I'm able to monitor their progress through tests they take and the assignments they do. Clear statement followed up with a short description. On to the next one. Another way I monitor students' progress is by using homework and in-class assignments. For example, I would teach a lesson in math, then give homework. The students who got low grades on the math would come to a group for a reteach or complete a reteach on the computer. Third bullet, I feel like I struggle with finding different ways to measure reading comprehension while we're doing our reading assignments. I also struggle with finding ways to assess and monitor students' progress towards meeting the writing standards. Very clear, very concise, well targeted to the prompt. One of the areas that participating teachers particularly find challenges is in reference to multi-tiered interventions. And so here we're using terminology and we want to make sure that we clearly understand what is meant by multi-tiered interventions in the standard and in the resulting prompt. So let's take a look at the clarification. Consider how you adjust your lessons and strategies such that all students regardless of reading levels or English language abilities, etc., can participate and succeed. Is scaffolding a part of your lesson structure? So multi-tiered interventions is referring to strategies used so that within any particular lesson or lesson series, all students are obtaining content information at the level they need, whether it be struggling students or advanced students. Let's take a look at this example. I use multi-tiered interventions in math. We use Go Math program. I will teach a lesson, then have the students do a couple problems on their own. If they get them correct, they can continue. If they get them wrong, I either have them get them on a computer program for a reteach or, pull a small group for a reteach. So what this teacher is saying is, I structure my lessons so that students from those that are already the most successful to those who are struggling each have an opportunity to engage in the lesson plan and advance their learning. Next bullet, in reading, I use multi-tiered interventions with the help of Plato. Each of my students has certain skills they need to work on based on an assessment they took in the program. The skills go along with the standards we're working on in class. Clearly targeted response, concisely explained. Here's the struggle. I struggle with finding and using multi-tiered interventions in writing. I would like to find new ways to differentiate writing lessons to meet the needs of all learners. We're just going to look at two more prompts. What we've selected for this video are those that tend to be ones that participating teachers struggle with the most. So we're going to take a look at inclusive environments. The prompt is, in what ways do you support students from all ethnic, racial, socioeconomic, cultural, academic, and linguistic backgrounds, gender, gender identity, and sexual orientation? I have changed the screen so that you can see one of the supports here that is not yet included within the active document. Describe specific strategies you use to ensure that all students, regardless of their socioeconomic, cultural, racial, ethnic, or gender background, are safe in your classroom. Let's go back to the original standard to see if that will help us. This says that participating teachers maximize academic achievement for students from all of these types of backgrounds. It also says participating teachers protect and support all students by designing and implementing equitable and inclusive learning environments. So hopefully that helps us to understand this prompt that's based on inclusive environment. So how do we ensure that students from all of these varieties of backgrounds and orientations are included and safe within our classrooms? Let's take a look at one response to this prompt that may help us better understand the prompt itself. So here the teacher says, I taught a lesson on fair versus equal at the beginning of the year and reteach it every month or so. This ensures that my students know the difference and are not upset when I give one student less work due to their ability. It also taught my students that there are many different people in the class and we need to help all of them in different ways. The other prompt says we also do second step twice a week. This has helped teach my students about different feelings, how others are different, and how we can empathy and help them all. It would be helpful in this response if we had just one sentence as to what second step is, because unless you're familiar with that program, you really don't know what the teacher is referring to. This can be a challenging question, but remember it's very specifically what you do to support students from all those different backgrounds and orientation. We're back to our document with tags, and we're going to look at just one more. And the reason we're looking at this particular prompt is it is very easy for participating teachers to struggle a little bit with differentiating between this inclusive environments and teaching practice. So let's remember this is about inclusive environments, and this is about our actual teaching practice and how we deliver content and social information. So here is our question. What culturally responsive teaching practices do you use to overcome the effects of bias? That is a standalone question, may be challenging to determine what's really being asked. We have our standard here. We also have an additional prompt to help us. Describe how you integrate literature and resources from your students' cultures into your lessons. That is something to help and support you. If that's not something that you do in your teaching practice, then you would move forward. Identify how you integrate what students already know from home, community, and school. In order to provide you with additional support for this particular prompt and question, we wanted to include this information. These are characteristics that really mirror the tenets of what we call culturally responsive curriculum. So you may want to have this by your side to consider as you begin to answer this question. Culturally responsive curriculum includes respect for the legitimacy of different cultures. This would be something more than simply talking about specific holidays during the holidays. Empowering students to value all cultures, not just their own, incorporating cultural information into the curriculum instead of simply adding it on. Relating new information to students' life experiences, teaching to the whole child and treating the classroom like a community, addressing a spectrum of learning styles, and maintaining high expectations for student success. So between the supports on the actual document and this information that you're receiving right here, we hope that you'll be able to respond to this question or prompt about your teaching practice most effectively. Once you have completed all of your responses to each of the induction program standards and prompts included on the self-assessment documents, you'll want to discuss this with your support provider. Often this is the most valuable part of your reflection upon your practice. You may find that after these discussions you'll want to add information to your self-assessments. Once you've completed your work with your support provider and he or she has reviewed your information, your support provider will then sign here that they've discussed the self-assessment with you and reviewed the work. It is complete and meets expectations. You'll then move on to your fact verification process that is very specific within your district or hub. And this is where you will have the chance for a second reviewer to sign off on your information. Next steps. You're going to find that whether you're year 1 or year 2, during this current induction year, you will be responding 2 times to the prompts and the questions. You have an initial assessment and a final assessment. Your final assessment should have some connection to your initial. You may want to update something perhaps that was a challenge or speak to something that's a strength. It doesn't mean in your final assessment you have to find all new strengths. Perhaps something that was a strength in your initial assessment you found is even stronger now. So these are not necessarily meant to be disconnected self-assessments. You're still moving forward in your practice, and so hopefully there's some connection, although hopefully also you will have found some new information for your final self-assessment. I hope this review supports you as you complete the self-assessments and you're able to view those portions that are most meaningful to you. Thank you.